First, let's create a test class for the ArtifactService class. Select the class name, and we will ask IntelliJ to create a test class for this class. We're going to use JUnit 5 framework. The class name is good, so this is the naming convention of a test class. ArtifactService is the class under test, and then we're going to put test as a postfix. Make sure you click Setup, Add Before, Tear Down, Add After, and this is the method that we want to test, and click OK. Where is the location of the test class generated? It is under SRC, Test, Java, the root package, and the artifact package right here. So let me expand this as well. If you compare the directory structure of SRC main and SRC test, you will find that they are very similar. Each test class actually corresponds to a class in the main directory. So ideally, we need to create at least one test class for each class we created in the main directory. This can provide a high test coverage for the source code. Let me briefly explain what those generated method stubs mean. A method with @test annotation, like in this case, findById. Well, let's give it a better name. I'm going to call it test findById success. So this is the successful scenario. A method with @test annotation is called a test method. Here, we're going to test the findById method in the artifact service at before each. This means before each test method gets executed by JUnit 5, setup is executed first. At after each, tear down gets called after each test method finishes. It is a good idea to put some housekeeping stuff or cleaning up in either setup or tear down. Next, let's write a test case for findById. In other words, let's implement the test method, test findById success. Let me split my screen vertically. As you can see, the above is the class under test, and the below is the test class. How do we write a test? If you recall the sequence diagram I showed you before in the slides, we know that the artifact service depends on the artifact repository to get an artifact from the database. But the problem here is that we have not set up any database yet. So this artifact repository right here is not working at all. So how does the artifact service work without a functional repository in this testing environment? Let me introduce an important testing technique called mocking. Inside this test class, we can replace the artifact repository by a mock that simulates the behavior of the real artifact repository. This mock can return some fake data once called instead of querying the real database. As a matter of fact, even though the database was ready, we will still mock the repository's behavior because a key point of unit test is to test an object in isolation. In this case, we want to test the artifact service in isolation. we do not want the quality of any dependencies, like in this case, the artifact repository, to influence the results of testing the artifact service. In short, mocking is creating objects that simulate the behavior of real objects. Here, we're using a popular mock framework called Mockito. So first, in order to use Mockito, let's annotate the test class with @extendWith Mockito extension.class. Since we're going to mock artifact repository, first, let's introduce artifact repository into the test class. We are also going to introduce the class under test into this test class. To mock the behavior of artifact repository, we have to use an annotation called @mock. This tells Mockito that this is the object that we want to simulate. Don't call the real artifact repository. We also need Mockito to help us inject this mock into this object of the class under test. And we can do that by using this annotation @inject mocks. When this test case is started, Mockito will inject a mock of the artifact repository object into an artifact service object. So in this test class, the artifact service is not using the real repository, but just a mock that simulates the repository's behavior. Okay, once we set up the mocks, let's go all the way down to the test method. Test findById success. Let's finish this method. When defining a test method or test case, we follow 3 steps. Given, when, and then. The given step is where you prepare some fake data and define the behavior of the mock. So let me write a comment here. Arrange inputs and targets. Define the behavior of mock object. Artifact repository. What is when? The when is where you call the method to be tested. In this case, ArtifactService.findById, and we pass a artifact ID to it. Let me write some comments. Act on the target behavior, which is artifact service, when steps should cover the method to be tested. What is then? The then step, which is also known as the assert step, is where you compare the result of the call from when with the expected result. If the assertion evaluates to true, the test has been successful. If the assertion is false, then it has failed. So let me write some comments here. Assert expected outcomes. Let's finish them one by one. First, for given. Since we haven't connected to any database, first, let's create a fake artifact data that we want the repository to return when we call the repository's findById. Now, be careful. The repository also has a findById method. Don't confuse it with the findById in ArtifactService. Where can I get some fake data? Don't know. Let's take a look at the API documentation. Okay, it's here. So let me copy this part. And paste it here. Let's create an artifact object. a.setId, copy, paste. a.setName, this is invisibility cloak. a.setDescription. a.setImageURL. Next, let's create a fake wizard. And this wizard will be the owner of this artifact. So the ID is 2. That's the ID of Harry Potter in the API documentation. Set name. Next, let's set the owner of the artifact. Okay, we're done with the fake artifact and wizard data. Next, we're going to define the behavior of the mock artifact repository. So when artifact repository.findById gets called, we want the mock to return this artifact instead of going to the database. Here is the syntax. Given artifact repository dot findById, and this is the ID. Copy and paste. Okay, make sure we import the given. It is bdd mockito.given, the second one. Dot will return A. This means when the findById method of the repository gets called with this artifact ID, A will be returned. But it looks like this will return does not like the A. So let's move the cursor over, and it says, cannot resolve method will return artifact. Wrap this artifact using optional. Okay, this is something you should remember. Before you want to mock the behavior of something, you really need to know what it returns. So, what does the repository's findById return? It looks like here it's not returning the artifact, but it returns an optional. Is that true? Don't know. Let's take a look at the source code. So let's go to artifact repository. It's empty. Let's keep going to its parent interface. And if you scroll down, you cannot find findById. And let's keep going. It turns out that the findById method is defined in CRUD repository. So if you scroll down, there it is. The findById from the repository takes an ID, and it returns an optional. Java 8 introduced a new class called optional in the java.util package. It can help in writing a neat code without using too many null checks. So we need to use an optional object to wrap the artifact object. This will make sense later on. So let's go back to ArtifactService test class. So here, instead of returning the artifact directly, let's wrap it, cut, in an optional. Let me write some comments here. Defines the behavior of the mock object. And let me close those. Okay, we're done about the given step. We have set up some fake data, and we have defined the behavior of the mock object artifact repository. Next, let's move on to the when step. We're going to invoke the findById method in ArtifactService. So you remember we have a field called ArtifactService in this ArtifactService test class. Dot findById. And we're going to pass this artifact ID to it. Now it returns an artifact. So let's call this returned artifact. That's it. That's how we act on the target behavior. Next, let's move on to the then part. We're going to compare the returned artifact with expected outcomes. Here is how we do that. We're going to use AssertThat. Make sure you pick the second one, which is assertions.assertThat from org.assertj.core.api. The second one. AssertThat returned artifact dot get ID is equal to a dot get ID. Because this is what a repository returns. And this is what the service returns. So here we want to make sure they match. And then let's copy and paste, because we have 4 fields. Get name, get description, get image URL. So we're comparing the actual values with the expected values. Now in the end, we can also verify that the findById method of the mock, which is artifact repository, gets called exactly once. So here is the syntax. Verify, we're going to use the verify from Mockito, the first one. Artifact repository times one time dot findById. And let's copy this ID and paste here. So here we're verifying that this mock objects method is called exactly once inside the service object. Before I start this test case, I want to make sure you import the right methods and classes. This given is from org.mockito.bdd Mockito. This assert that is from org.AssertJ.core.api.assertions. This verify is from org.mockito.mockito. Make sure you import the correct ones. Let's start this test case. How? It's very simple. There is a play button on the left side of the name of the test method. So just click run. And not surprisingly, it fails because of the null pointer exception. Because in this current method, it returns null. Okay? So let's fix that. Let's write just enough implementation code in this method to make the test pass. It is actually very simple. There's only one line, which is, so let me close this. So now we're in ArtifactService. It's going to return this dot artifact repository dot findById and pass the artifact ID to findById of the artifact repository. But this won't work because we know findById returns an optional, but the service is going to return an artifact. Then how do we retrieve the artifact from the optional? There is a method called get. Okay, now it stops complaining. Let's go back to the test case and click run again. We're going to run a test again after we implement the findById. Run again. Okay, as you can see now, it's green. It passed. We're not done yet. Next, let's work on the refactoring or optimization. In refactoring or optimization, usually we come up with more test cases to consider some possible exceptions. Let's go back to our API documentation. As you can see, besides the successful response, if you call this endpoint findArtifactById, it is also possible that the artifact is not found. In other words, the provided ID may be invalid. It doesn't exist in the database. But in our current test case, we haven't considered that. So let's go back and create one more test case. Close this. Add test void test find by ID not found. So that's another scenario. We're still going to follow the 3 steps. Given, when, and then. In this case, there is no need to prepare any fake data because we're not going to return anything, right? It's not found. But we still have to define the behavior of the mock, the artifact repository. So here is what you should do. Given artifact repository dot find by ID. And in this case, I don't want to provide a particular ID because I do not know what invalid ID the client will produce, right? So I'm going to use a workaround called Mockito dot any string dot class. Okay, so any string passed to findById will return an optional with no artifact in it. Here is the syntax. Optional dot empty. Okay, so if the service is invoking artifact repository.findById and pass an invalid ID, then this method will just return an empty optional object. Okay, so this is simple. It'll be similar to the success scenario. So let's copy this and paste here. Before we move on, let's think about how do we handle the not found. There are many possible ways to handle an unsuccessful scenario, like in this case, not found. Here is what I would do. Once the artifact service finds out that the returned artifact from the repository is empty, is null, it should throw an exception called artifact not found exception instead of keep processing it. So terminates and throw exception, and then the service logic is done. Then how do we capture the exception thrown from this findById method in this test class? Here is the syntax. So first, let me cut this, because in this case, the framework cannot capture the exception thrown by findById. So let's cut it. Throwable, thrown, assignment operator, catch, throwable. Okay, select the first one from assertions. And inside, we're going to define a lambda expression. And paste what we copied before. Let me briefly explain this. Line 81 to 83 means if ArtifactService.findById throws an exception, then catchThrowable will catch the exception and assign that exception to thrown variable so that we can use that in the then part, in the then step. Okay, next, let's move to the then part. In the then part, in this scenario, we're actually expecting that exception. We're looking forward to it. So we're going to assert if that exception is really thrown by findById from artifact service. So here is the syntax. Assert that thrown is an instance of artifact not found exception.class. Dot has message. Could not find artifact with ID. Let me copy this, paste here, and a set face. Now apparently this line is too long, so let me format it. So line 86 to 88 is verifying if the exception thrown by ArtifactService.findById, that is line 86, is an instance of artifact not found exception.class. The compiler is complaining because we haven't got this class created, so that's fine. Besides that, the exception should have a message called could not find artifact with ID blah and set face. As usual, we should verify that the repository's findById method gets called exactly once. And here we can copy from the previous test case. Copy. Paste here. Okay, to make the compiler happy, let's create this class, artifact not found exception. Let's copy this. Let's right-click artifact, new a class. how do we make this class an exception class? It's very simple. We're going to have this class extends runtime exception, because not found is really a runtime exception. Okay, we can only know that when the entire application is up, when we search the database, and we got this runtime exception. Let's define a constructor. Public artifact not found exception. It takes a string, which is the ID of the artifact. And inside this constructor, let's call the constructor of its parent, super. And we're going to pass the exception message to super. Could not find artifact with ID plus, and don't forget this set phase. Let's go back to ArtifactService test. Now there is no compiling errors. Let's launch it. Run test findById not found. And no surprise, it will fail. And let's look at the message. So the assertion error is expecting. That means we're expecting the actual throwable to be an instance of this, but it was a different exception, got no such element exception. Okay, then let's go back to our ArtifactService class and let's refactor this, because in this case, we didn't consider throwing an exception if the findById of artifact repository returns an empty optional. What should we do? It's pretty simple. Let's get rid of this get, because this one doesn't consider the exceptions. This .artifact repository.findById returns an optional. An optional has a method called dot or else throw. It's expecting a lambda expression. So here is the lambda expression. New artifact not found exception. This is the class we just created. And if you remember, the constructor is expecting a string, the ID of the artifact. So let's pass the artifact ID to it. That's it. But again, this becomes too long. So let me break it here. Make sure it is properly formatted. So line 18 to line 19 means we're trying to find by ID using artifact repository. If found, we will just return artifact to the controller. Else, this findById method of ArtifactService will throw an exception. And this exception is of type artifact not found exception. The message will be this one. Could not find artifact with ID this set phase. Okay. Oh, as you can see, using Java optional, this eliminates the verbose if-else code block to check nulls. It is more fluent, and it reads like English. findById or else throw. All right, so let's launch the test case again. So right now it's red, it's failed. Let's run test findById not found. And it passes. At this point, we're done with developing the findById method in ArtifactService class. Let's move on to the controller.